War has a way of exposing dangerous illusions, especially the ones leaders believe without question. In the early hours of August 21, 1942, long before the sun dared to rise over the jungles of Guadalcanal, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood silently at the edge of a dense coconut grove. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, pressing against the lungs like an invisible weight. Sweat clung to every inch of skin. Mosquitoes moved in relentless swarms, feeding on anything that breathed. Ahead of him, beyond a narrow stretch of dark water the Americans would later call Alligator Creek, an unseen enemy waited in silence. Ichiki could not see them, but in his mind he didn't need to. To him, the outcome of what was about to happen had already been decided. Behind him, nearly 900 hand-picked soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army prepared themselves in the darkness. These were not ordinary troops. They were veterans, men who had survived years of brutal warfare in China, hardened by impossible odds and relentless combat. They had marched, fought, and conquered without ever truly tasting defeat. Tonight they believed would be no different. Ichiki had told his officers this battle would be quick. Less than 2 hours, he estimated. A swift, decisive strike. By sunrise, the Americans would be wiped out, their newly captured airfield reclaimed, and order restored to the Emperor's domain. Because in Ichiki's mind, the enemy was already broken. He, like many Japanese officers of the time, had spent years studying Western forces. What he believed he understood shaped every decision he was about to make. Americans, he thought, were weak, softened by comfort, distracted by entertainment, raised in a world of luxury, far removed from hardship or sacrifice. They lacked discipline, they lacked honor, and most importantly, they lacked the will to die for something greater than themselves. This wasn't just his opinion. It was doctrine. Official Japanese military assessments had described American soldiers in blunt, dismissive terms: arrogant, fragile, and unwilling to endure real suffering. To Ichiki, this battle wasn't a risk. It was a formality, a necessary step before victory. What he didn't realize was that within the next 17 hours, everything he believed about war and about his enemy would collapse in fire, blood, and unimaginable loss. Ichiki lowered himself into a crouch, the damp soil pressing against his knees as he studied the darkness ahead one last time. The jungle was alive, not with men, but with sound. Insects buzzed in chaotic rhythm. Leaves shifted with unseen movement. Somewhere in the distance, waves broke gently along the shore, a calm contrast to the violence about to unfold. Yet beneath that natural noise, there was something else. Silence, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it warns. Across the shallow lagoon, American Marines waited in complete stillness. No shouting, no careless movement, no visible patrols. To Ichiki, this confirmed everything he already believed. They're hiding, he had told his officers earlier. They fear us. That assumption would prove fatal. He had been given clear orders from Imperial General Headquarters. Wait for reinforcements. A second wave of over 1,000 additional troops was already on its way. Together they would form a force strong enough to overwhelm any resistance. But Ichiki saw no need to wait. Why delay victory? For an enemy he did not respect. Confidence turned into impatience, and impatience into a decision that would seal the fate of hundreds of men. He straightened slightly and looked back at his soldiers. Some were checking their rifles in the dim light. Others tightened their grips on bayonets, whispering quiet words to themselves. Prayers, perhaps. Or final thoughts. Many of them had followed Ichiki through years of war. They trusted him completely. They believed in what they had been taught since the beginning, that the spirit of the Japanese soldier was unmatched, that courage could overcome any weapon, that death in battle was not a tragedy, but an honor. None of them expected what was waiting ahead. Ichiki rested his hand briefly on the hilt of his sword, a blade passed down through generations of warriors in his family. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of tradition, of pride, of an unbroken legacy of victory. Tonight, he believed, it would be used once again to prove that legacy true. Far to the east, hours earlier, his men had landed without resistance. No gunfire, no opposition, not even a sign that the Americans were watching. He had radioed his command with confidence. "We have successfully landed. There is no enemy presence." Then came the words that revealed everything about his mindset. "It is like marching through an empty land." But Guadalcanal was not empty. It was waiting. And while Ichiki advanced blindly forward, convinced of his superiority, events had already been set in motion that would turn this easy victory into one of the most shocking defeats of the Pacific War. Because the Americans knew he was coming. while Ichiki marched forward under the illusion of surprise. Far away, thousands of miles across the Pacific, the truth had already been uncovered. This battle had been predicted. Inside a quiet intelligence station in Hawaii, known as Station Hypo, American codebreakers had been working tirelessly, intercepting and deciphering Japanese communications. Days earlier, fragments of information began to form a clear and alarming picture. A Japanese unit, transported by destroyers, heading toward a coded destination. RXI American analysts didn't guess. They knew. RXI meant Guadalcanal, and more importantly, they knew when the enemy would arrive. Admiral Chester Nimitz wasted no time. A warning was sent directly to the commander on the island. Prepare for an imminent attack. On Guadalcanal, Major General Alexander Vandergrift received that message with full seriousness. Unlike Ichiki, he did not rely on assumptions. He prepared. Defensive lines were reinforced, patrols increased, weapons were positioned with precision. Every man was alerted, not with panic, but with purpose. Because the Marines weren't guessing either. They were waiting. But intelligence from intercepted messages wasn't the only warning. The jungle itself began to speak. On the morning of August 19th, a patrol of around 60 Marines moved cautiously along a narrow coastal trail east of their defensive perimeter. Leading them was Captain Charles Brush, a man who understood that in jungle warfare, the enemy could be anywhere or nowhere at all. The heat was already suffocating. Sweat soaked their uniforms within minutes. Every step through the thick vegetation felt heavy. Visibility was limited. Every sound, every snapped twig, every rustle could mean death. They advanced carefully. Then suddenly, movement. Ahead on the trail, a group of Japanese soldiers appeared. About 30 to 40 men, walking casually, completely unaware they were being watched. They weren't in formation. They weren't cautious. They didn't expect resistance. It was a fatal mistake. Brush reacted instantly. He split his men, setting up a classic ambush. One group would strike from the front, another would circle through the jungle and cut off escape. Seconds later, chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the silence. The ambush was swift, violent, and merciless. Within less than an hour, nearly every Japanese soldier in that patrol lay dead. Only a handful managed to escape. But what the Marines found on those bodies was even more important than the victory itself. Documents, maps, detailed positions. This wasn't just a patrol. This was the advance element of something much bigger, something already moving toward them. The attack Ichiki believed would be a surprise had just lost its greatest advantage, and now the Marines knew exactly what was coming. The moment those documents were placed in the hands of command, everything changed. What had once been uncertainty became preparation. General Alexander Vandergrift didn't hesitate. Orders spread quickly across the Marine lines. Reinforce the eastern perimeter. Dig in, get ready. Because now they knew, this wasn't a small probe. This was an attack, and it was coming straight at them. At the center of that defensive line stood Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, a hardened officer who understood one brutal truth about jungle warfare. The terrain decides everything. Pollock studied the ground east of the Marine position carefully, and what he found would determine the outcome of the entire battle. A narrow tidal lagoon stretched across the approach, a place the Marines called Alligator Creek. It wasn't wide, but it didn't need to be. At its mouth was a thin strip of sand, a natural crossing point, about 50 feet wide, exposed, with no cover. Anyone trying to attack from the east would have no choice but to cross it. And that made it a perfect killing ground. Pollock didn't waste a second. He positioned his men along the western bank, spreading them across the line with calculated precision. Fighting holes were dug deep into the soft earth. Fields of fire were cleared through the thick vegetation. Every angle was covered, every movement anticipated. A single strand of barbed wire was stretched across the sandbar, not to stop the enemy, but to slow them down just enough to die there. Machine guns were placed in overlapping positions, ensuring that no matter where an enemy stepped, they would be exposed to deadly crossfire. Behind them, artillery units calibrated their aim, locking coordinates onto the eastern bank. But perhaps the most devastating weapons of all were the 37mm anti-tank guns. Originally designed to destroy armored vehicles, they were now loaded with canister rounds, each shell packed with over 100 steel balls. At close range, they didn't fire like cannons. They fired like giant shotguns. Anything caught in front of them wouldn't survive. Among the men preparing in the darkness was a 21-year-old Marine named Al Schmid. Before the war, he had been a simple steelworker from Philadelphia. Just a regular guy with a normal life. A job, a future, a fiancée waiting for him back home. Now he sat behind a water-cooled Browning machine gun, staring into the blackness across the creek. Beside him were two other Marines, friends forged through training and the long journey across the Pacific. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Each of them understood what was coming. Their machine gun was aimed directly at the sandbar. The only path the enemy could take. The air was thick, heavy, still. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. And then, something changed. Far out in the darkness, a sound. Faint at first, then clearer. Footsteps. Hundreds of them. The enemy had arrived just when the tension seemed unbearable. Fate delivered one final warning, and it came from a man who should have already been dead. His name was Jacob Vuza, a local scout, a former sergeant major, and someone who knew the jungles of Guadalcanal better than anyone alive. He had spent decades walking those trails, understanding every hidden path, every stream, every shadow. When the war reached his island, he didn't run. He chose a side. Vuza aligned himself with the Allied Coast Watchers, a network of observers who risked their lives to track Japanese movements deep behind enemy lines. To the Marines, he quickly became more than just a scout. He became their eyes in the jungle. On August 20th, he was sent on a dangerous mission. Move behind Japanese lines, locate the enemy force, and report back. He succeeded. But on his way back, everything went wrong. While crossing a river, the current pulled him off balance and dragged him downstream, straight into the path of a Japanese patrol. They captured him instantly, and when they searched his body, they found something that sealed his fate. A small American flag, hidden, protected, proof of where his loyalty truly lay. What followed was brutal. He was tied to a tree, questioned, demanded to speak. Where are the Marines? How many are there? What are their defenses? Vuza said nothing, so the soldiers began to beat him. Rifle butts slammed into his body. Blows rained down again and again. Still, he refused to speak. Then came the blades. They cut his arms, his chest, his face. Still nothing. They stabbed him, repeatedly, in the throat, shoulders, and stomach, trying to break him through pain. But pain didn't break him. Because for Vuza this wasn't just information. This was his land, his people, and the men he now called brothers. The Japanese officer, frustrated, changed tactics. Instead of asking questions, he started talking. He described the attack. How many men would charge, where they would cross, how the Marines would be slaughtered in the darkness. He believed the fear of losing his allies would finally break Vuza. It didn't. Hours later, convinced he was dying, they left him tied to the tree and moved on. But Vuza wasn't dead. Not even close. Alone. Bleeding. Barely able to breathe. He began doing the impossible. He started chewing through the ropes binding his hands. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body. Blood poured from open wounds. His throat was cut so deeply he struggled to breathe. But he didn't stop. Finally, the ropes gave way. He collapsed to the ground for a moment. Then, he started crawling. For nearly 3 miles. Through jungle. Through pain. Through darkness. Driven by one thing. Warning the Marines. By the time he reached their lines, he was barely conscious. But before allowing anyone to treat him, he forced out the words that mattered most. They are coming. Now. There was no more time to think. Only minutes remained. The warning spread like electricity through the Marine lines. Men tightened their grips on rifles. Machine gunners made final adjustments. Officers moved quickly from position to position, checking readiness. No speeches, no panic, just focus. Across the creek, the darkness shifted. Then, at exactly 01:30 a.m., they came. From the shadows of the coconut grove, the first wave of Japanese soldiers burst forward. Around 100 men surged out at once, charging straight toward the sandbar. They weren't silent. They screamed. War cries tore through the night as rifles fired wildly. Officers raised swords overhead, shouting commands, driving their men forward with pure intensity. Green flares shot into the sky, casting a sickly glow over the battlefield, illuminating faces twisted with determination and fear. To the Japanese, this was psychological warfare. Noise, speed, aggression, enough to break a soft enemy before real fighting even began. But the Marines didn't move. They didn't fire. They didn't panic. They waited. Every second stretched tight as the charging soldiers reached the sandbar. Then halfway across it, completely exposed, with no cover, no escape. That's when it happened. The Marine line erupted. Gunfire exploded all at once, A deafening wall of sound that swallowed the night. Rifles cracked in rapid succession. Machine guns roared like engines of destruction. Tracers tore through the darkness, streaking low across the water. And then, the 37mm guns fired. Each blast unleashed a storm of steel, shredding through the tightly packed formation. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was devastation. Men dropped instantly. Others stumbled forward over the bodies, only to be cut down seconds later. The sandbar turned into chaos. Bodies piling on top of each other, the ground churning into mud and blood. Some soldiers kept pushing, driven by training, by belief, by desperation. A few reached the barbed wire on the Marine side, throwing themselves against it, trying to tear it apart with bare hands. They were shot at point-blank range. A handful actually made it through, reaching Marine positions where the fight turned brutal and personal. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists in the darkness. But they didn't last. Within minutes, the first assault collapsed. What remained of the attacking force retreated into the trees, dragging the wounded, leaving behind a field of dead scattered across the sand and floating in the shallow water. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by distant groans, and the sound of the ocean. Any experienced commander would have seen the truth immediately. This attack had failed. The enemy was not weak. They were not fleeing. They were prepared. But Colonel Ichiki saw something else. He saw a test. And in his mind, the test had not yet been passed. For a brief moment, the battlefield went quiet. Smoke drifted low over the sandbar. The water moved slowly again, carrying bodies with it. The screams had faded, replaced by scattered groans from the wounded left behind in the darkness. It should have been over. It wasn't. From the coconut grove, Ichiki prepared another assault. He had seen the destruction. He had watched his men get cut down in seconds. Any rational commander would have pulled back, reassessed, waited for reinforcements. But Ichiki didn't believe he had failed. He believed his men simply hadn't pushed hard enough. So he gave the order again. At around 02:30 a.m., a second wave formed, larger this time. Between 150 and 200 soldiers gathered in the darkness, preparing to charge the exact same position that had just turned into a graveyard. Before they moved, mortars opened fire. Shells crashed into the Marine lines, exploding in bursts of dirt and shrapnel. The ground shook. Sandbags tore open. Fragments ripped through the air. For a moment, it looked like the Marines might finally break. But they didn't. They stayed low, pressed into their positions, riding out the barrage in silence, waiting. Then, just like before, the Japanese charged, screaming, running, committed, and just like before, the Marines held their fire until the last possible second. When the attackers were fully exposed on the sandbar, the night exploded again. Machine guns roared back to life. Rifles cracked non-stop. The 37mm cannons fired round after round, tearing through everything in front of them. The sandbar became even worse than before, a narrow strip of land now completely covered in bodies. At one of the key machine gun positions, 3 Marines fought without pause. Al Schmid was there, along with his crew. One fed ammunition, one directed fire, one pulled the trigger. They worked like a machine. Until suddenly, a burst of enemy fire cut through the darkness and struck one of them directly. He dropped instantly. No time to react, no time to say anything. Just gone. Schmid felt it immediately. Not just the loss, but the shock, the anger. The realization that this wasn't just battle anymore. This was survival. He shoved his fallen friend aside and took over. Now he was firing and reloading and aiming, all at once. The machine gun hammered continuously, its water-cooled system barely keeping up with the heat. Brass casings piled up around him. The barrel began to glow faintly in the darkness. Still, the enemy kept coming, wave after wave, driven by something deeper than fear. But it wasn't enough, because across that sandbar, nothing could survive. By the time the second assault ended, the ground wasn't even visible anymore. Only bodies, stacked, scattered, motionless, and yet, Ichiki still refused to stop. By now, the night had turned into something unrecognizable. The battlefield wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a nightmare. The sandbar had become a grave. The lagoon carried the dead like silent witnesses. And still, Colonel Ichiki refused to accept what was happening in front of him. So he tried something different. Around 5:00 a.m., with the sky just beginning to lighten, he ordered a flanking maneuver. Instead of charging directly across the sandbar again, a group of soldiers moved into the ocean, slipping into the dark surf. The plan was simple. Go around the Marine line, attack from the side, catch them off guard. But the Marines had already anticipated it. As the Japanese soldiers emerged from the water, soaked and exposed, machine guns shifted instantly toward the shoreline. Then, Fire! The beach lit up with tracers. Bullets tore into the advancing men before they could even organize. Some fell face first into the sand. Others staggered forward only a few steps before collapsing. The ocean itself began to push bodies back onto the shore. There was no breakthrough, no surprise, just more loss. One by one, every attempt failed. And for the first time, something began to change. Not in the Marines, in the Japanese ranks, because now the reality was impossible to ignore. The enemy wasn't running, they weren't breaking, they weren't afraid, they were holding, and they were winning. As dawn finally approached, Ichiki ordered his surviving men to pull back into a coconut grove roughly 200 yards from the creek. What remained of his once confident force gathered there, exhausted, wounded, shaken, but not retreating. Retreat was not part of their mindset, not part of their training, not part of their identity. Japanese soldiers were expected to fight to the death, to hold position no matter the cost, to wait for reinforcements, or die where they stood. And Ichiki intended to do exactly that. What he didn't realize was that the battle had already shifted beyond his control, because as the sun began to rise over Guadalcanal, the Marines were no longer just defending. They were preparing to finish it. Behind the lines, fresh units were moving into position. Plans were already forming for a counterattack, and above them something new entered the battlefield. The sound of engines, low, growing louder. American aircraft, the airfield Ichiki believed he would capture by morning, was now operational, and it was about to turn against him. The night had belonged to defense, but the daylight would belong to destruction. The first light of dawn didn't bring relief. It revealed the truth. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal, the full scale of the battlefield came into view. The sandbar, now unrecognizable. The water stained dark. Bodies scattered in every direction. What had happened during the night was no longer hidden. And for the survivors in the coconut grove, it was impossible to ignore. But the worst was still coming. From above, the low roar of engines cut through the heavy morning air. American aircraft. The very airfield Ichiki had dismissed as an easy objective was now alive. And it was about to strike back. Fighters and dive bombers swept over the grove, unleashing machine gun fire into the clustered Japanese positions. There was nowhere to hide. Men scattered, diving for cover behind trees, into shallow pits, into anything that might shield them. It wasn't enough. Moments later, something even more terrifying appeared. Movement across the sandbar. Slow, heavy, unstoppable. American tanks. They rolled forward with mechanical certainty, crushing over debris, over weapons, over bodies. To the exhausted Japanese soldiers, they must have looked unreal, like something out of another world, because they had no answer for them. No anti-tank weapons, no plan, only rifles, and courage. And against steel, that wasn't enough. The tanks opened fire. Cannons blasted through clusters of men. Machine guns sprayed relentlessly, cutting down anyone who moved. Palm trees shattered, dirt exploded. The coconut grove became chaos. Some Japanese soldiers, in pure desperation, charged the tanks. They climbed onto them, striking with swords, throwing grenades, trying to stop something that couldn't be stopped. The Marines had trained for this. The tanks moved in coordination, covering each other, firing at anything that got close. Those who climbed onto the armor were shot at point-blank range. Then came the crushing. Tracks rolled forward without hesitation. Over the wounded, over the living, over everything. By midday, organized resistance was gone. What remained was silence, broken only by isolated shots and the distant sound of the battlefield settling into stillness. By late afternoon, it was over. Completely. The coconut grove had turned into a graveyard. Hundreds of bodies lay where they had fallen, some piled on top of each other. The heat of the tropical sun had already begun its work. The smell of death filled the air. Of the force that had landed with such confidence, almost nothing remained. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was among the dead. Exactly how he died, no one knows for certain, but his fate was the same as his men. Final. Absolute. The battle he believed would take 2 hours had destroyed his entire force in less than a day. By the end of August 21, 1942, the illusion was gone. What remained on the sands of Guadalcanal was more than just the aftermath of a battle. It was the collapse of a belief system that had driven an empire forward for months without defeat. Out of the 900 men who had landed with such certainty, over 800 were dead. An entire elite unit erased in less than 24 hours. The few survivors who escaped carried back a message that many in the Japanese command initially refused to believe. They had been defeated, not just resisted, but destroyed. For months, the Imperial Japanese Army had advanced across the Pacific like an unstoppable force, capturing territory after territory, defeating every army that stood in its path. They believed they were invincible. That belief died at Alligator Creek. For the Americans, this battle proved something equally powerful. The enemy could bleed. The enemy could be stopped. And most importantly, the enemy could be beaten. Men like Al Schmid, who kept firing even after losing his sight, became symbols of a different kind of strength. Not one built on arrogance, but on resilience. Not on assumption, but on reality. And then there was Jacob Vuza, who endured unimaginable torture and still crawled miles through the jungle to warn the Marines. Stories like theirs didn't just shape the outcome of one battle. They shaped the entire war. Because after Guadalcanal, nothing was the same. The myth of easy victories disappeared. Future battles would be longer, bloodier, and far more brutal than anything either side had imagined. But the lesson of that night remained clear. Arrogance kills. Underestimating your enemy kills even faster. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki didn't just lose a battle. He lost because he believed he couldn't lose. And hundreds of men paid the price for that belief. History is full of moments like this, where confidence becomes blindness and certainty becomes catastrophe. This was one of them.